Isn't about how you're perceived, right? It's not like, okay, let's choose this costume so that the audience think. It's more, how does this person choose to express parts of themselves somehow?
Hello and welcome to Entertainment Weekly's The Awardist. I'm David Canfield, EW's movies editor. I'm joined now by Vanessa Kirby. She stars in the upcoming films Pieces of a Woman and The World to Come. Pieces of a Woman hitting Netflix at the beginning of January, and The World to Come, of course, coming out later this year. Thank you so much for joining us, Vanessa.
Thank you for having me.
These two films are not the lightest of watches, but it's
Mm.
quite an impressive moment for you to have these two movies. They're both really rich and complicated and cinematically really ambitious as well. I wanted to start by getting your sense on the process of making these. Did you film them back to back? What was that like going from one to the next?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually because I literally filmed them back to back. And the Mona Fasshold, who directed World to Come, and Cornell, who directed Pieces, they're really good friends. And so Mona said it's like these weird sister productions because they're kind of dealing with grief and a mother losing her child. So it was quite strange, really. And in World to Come, we did winter, we did some summer scenes in August, and then we came back in November and did winter scenes. And so in the interim between those seasons, I was rehearsing Pieces of a Woman. So it really was a strange crossover.
So doing World to Come first, it's obviously a period piece, and you've got quite a. I love your look in the movie, particularly you've got this great hair.
Mm.
um, what was it like finding your way into that role and then finding your way out of it, especially because you're going from this period setting to in Pieces of a Woman, this sort of very harshly contemporary world almost.
I felt so lucky that they're both such different characters in a way, you know. I think it would have been really hard if I'd have been playing Abigail in World to Come, you know. And it was such a pleasure to play Tally because she was one of these people who, you know, as soon as I read it, I thought, oh God, she's this life force. She's someone that literally lights up the room, and also it thinks so expansively. You know, she has such a huge imagination and rare for that time when everything is so stifling as a woman, and you're literally owned by the man that is chosen for you and by the home that you find yourself in. You're quite literally owned by it. And yet she was someone who, you know, instantly on the page, as you thought, she thinks bigger than the room she's in. And so I got to think such big, beautiful thoughts as her, and kind of, and she's a dreamer, and acting for me has always been about thinking someone else's thoughts. So it was amazing to play her because she just a really big life force energy. And then Martha was the opposite. Martha internalizes everything. So it was kind of trying to get into the opposite space in a way. And that was a kind of an exhilarating challenge, really. And so I was very grateful they were really different.
So with Pieces, did you film that chronologically? Of course, I'm asking because the film begins with its most sort of virtuosic and I think harrowing scene, this 30-minute or so one take, which ends quite tragically. What were those first few days like on set? Was that where you started?
That is where we started. And Cornell he always said, like, we have to start with the birth. And I completely agree because I was like, I wouldn't even know how I was going to play the rest of it, not knowing what it was like to have gone through that and to have actually felt that trauma that then kind of, you know, the rest of the film is someone recovering from. So I knew that he wanted to start with it, and I was pleased about that. And yet also we knew that we wanted to do it all in one take, and it could be up to 30 minutes. We didn't know how long it was going to be, but it was a kind of rough aim. And we it was obviously like incredibly daunting because we didn't quite know how we were going to do it, but we had a couple of days where we literally worked throughout the dance of it essentially. And then the very first morning we were so nervous. I think none of us slept. And yeah, we turned over on our first take that morning, and we did four takes the first day and two the second. And Cornell's used the fourth take of the first day. It was the best filming experience of my life, actually.
It must, I imagine, take quite a bit out of you though as well, especially filming so many takes. It is one of the most raw and intense scenes I've really ever seen on film.
Mm. Yeah, it is. It is, but it's also, I think what I was more afraid of, I was more afraid of is having to like, I don't know, cut and go for a break and, then maybe go into like the final part of the labor, having just had lunch, and suddenly it's action and you have to go into it, and you'd feel that it wasn't quite real. And I think I was more scared of that. I hadn't given birth myself, and I felt like such a duty to every woman that has, and every man that has been there witnessing, you know, a woman do it. I felt like, oh, I have to get this right. And so the idea of doing it all as one long thing, I kind of thought it would just force me to be totally present, because you couldn't think about what's just happened or the thing that's about to happen, that you just have to be in the moment. You're literally forced to be. So you kind of surrender to it and you just let it happen in a way. When you finish something like that, it does take a while to kind of, you've got to like rewind back to zero again. But I started off doing loads of theatre, and so I kind of I know the feeling of doing, I don't know, Streetcar Named Desire, which is like pretty much the most harrowing play ever written. And having to, after a matinee, be like, we've got an hour and then we've got to go back to the start. So that really helped me.
I was going to ask you about your theater background in terms of that scene, because it's at once it is obviously all the way through, and you do have to stay in that moment for such a long time before shaking it off. But then it's also so much about the camera and the claustrophobia of the way Cornell shoots it. Um, did you find that balance interesting at all? Like that there is that theatrical element of it, but it's also such a cinematic sequence.
And so technical, I guess. Yeah, I think what helped was Benjamin Loeb, who's the DOP. He was literally with us the whole time, like on the floor, like in that scene, but every scene. He held a gimbal, which is, the thing that you kind of like balance the camera on a, I don't know the technical term for it, I probably should. It is called gimbal, but I don't know how to describe it. But it kind of, hangs off a frame on that he has to, and it's impossible. It's really hard to carry that thing for 5 minutes even. So to do it for half an hour straight and not it up, basically. He was, I know that he was just under as much pressure as we were to not have the wheels come off. But because he was holding it and because he wasn't directing someone else doing it. And Cornell had him on the on like a mic, so could talk to him, was talking to him all the time over it really quietly. He was almost like the fourth character in the scene. So we knew he was there, and we could feel him being so present, and he was utterly with us in every step. But I personally wasn't that aware of where exactly he was. I knew there were some moments that I had to hit. I knew that there was a close up of my hand that I had to make sure when the bath was um was at the right moment. I could feel him coming in. I knew, there's a certain point we kind of had to roughly make it onto the bedroom. Um, and so we knew the shape of it. But other than that, we were just praying to the film gods that we could remotely pull it off, actually.
From there, you have to be, as you say, so closed off, and she really is so within herself and inscrutable almost in a lot of scenes. It's tough. It's a tough role overall. There's a lot of edges to her. She's not always the easiest character to read, almost because the grief is so deep. Um, how did you find your way through the rest of the film and her journey, and particularly that internalization of all that pain?
Mm. Yeah, I remember reading it going, God, this is such an unusual look at grief. And also because the dates are all broken up, it's September and then it's October and it's, December the 21st, but you don't see Christmas and you don't see New Year. So I had to imagine all the other times in it. And in a way, in the film, those dates are often like the hardest moments in her life, when the spelling isn't right on the gravestone for a funeral that she hasn't necessarily decided herself or been prepared for or necessarily wants to do it in that way. Um, or the moment that her husband tries to have sex with her again for the first time after something like that. That there's all these really difficult moments in her journey through grief. And I spent a lot of time with women who had lost their children in this way, or many women who had lots of miscarriages, or and actually the thing that they all had in common universally was that it's really hard to talk about, and that actually society finds it really difficult and like really deeply uncomfortable, and it's hardly spoken about. And the more people I spoke to, the more suddenly it was like, actually my friend or my friend of my friend or someone in my family, or there was this, it almost, once you speak about it, more people kind of come forward and go, oh, it's happened to me, I just haven't ever known how to describe it, or know if people would be open to hearing about it. So that gave me such a perspective, I guess, on, I tried to investigate why that was, both within those women and also in society. And a lot of them spoke about how, because it's come, the baby is in your body and it's come through your body, you feel, a lot of them said they felt like that there was something that they maybe did, and perhaps they had done a workout, or had drunk the wrong thing, all these things that your mind, goes to. And therefore there's a sort of there's a guilt or a kind of self blame, or a sense of failure, which it feels like shame. And I think shame is really hard to talk about and articulate. And so you kind of do close off and internalize. And so I had to really spend a lot of time with those women to really understand what that felt like, to try and begin to understand why Martha is so unreachable to everybody else.
You can see a lot of those considerations both in your performance and in the way the film is made. Um, at times it almost reminded me of films that aren't really made anymore, like more from 70s, 80s, that kind of period of filmmaking. And it was interesting having that in the back of my mind, where near the end of the film you have this remarkable scene opposite Ellen Burstyn, who is such an icon of that era. What was filming that scene like? What was working with her like? And I'm curious if you also felt that way about being in that style of filmmaking.
Yeah, I mean, the 70s for me is like Gina Rowlands is my hero. Um, Ellen is also one of them, so that was amazing, when she said yes to it. And I realized, like, oh God, okay, I'm really gonna have to try but try and pull this off for her, and also for Shia, who I'd always admired. I think we wanted to, I mean, I love Cassavetes, so I wanted that kind of idiosyncratic feeling in it anyway, and the kind of explosiveness of it, because I realized as well for Martha that although she's not outwardly, doesn't seem to be expressing anything inside, it's just the most like colossal turmoil, and like deepest grief you could ever imagine. And so those two things kind of in tandem were, I, I I really had to try and sort of get inside. And therefore it was actually such a relief to be able to just scream in a scene. I was like, it was just, I find it much easier to express. The character I played on The Crown was so expressive, and I loved it. And it was actually way more of my natural. I just find it easier. I've actually find it really hard to hold things in. So it was really challenging, feeling the thing but not being able to show it. There were so many times in scenes with Shia that I just wanted to come back at him, and just be like, as the character, just to go like head to head. But because Martha and her nature and what she's experiencing, I literally couldn't. So on that day, I didn't really know how it was going to come out. I knew that it was going to address Martha. All I knew was that Martha was going to be pushed to the point where she said something that she really felt, but she hasn't up to this point. So I kept thinking, okay, but so it's months and she hasn't said anything about how she feels. So she's going to have to be really pushed. And I think on the day we realized that Ellen would have to say something that would make, you know, Martha break, actually. And that was that line of, you'd have your baby in your arms right now if you listened to me. And therefore I think it had to come to that level to be able to allow the actual rage, and the pain to come out. So I just remember screaming in Ellen's face and just being like, I hope that's okay. But but then she just came up with this incredible monologue, and I was behind the camera, and she was just going and going and going. She's just doing that amazing Ellen thing she does, and you remember her speech in Requiem for a Dream is just so amazing. And it was one of those moments where you're just like, oh my God, she's, in her full force. So that was also like the birth, it had the same kind of feeling of, oh, this moment feels real, which is all you can ever hope for a couple of times in a film sometimes.
Mm. So you mentioned Princess Margaret on The Crown, which is, of course, I'm sure what many of our listeners how they were introduced to you. I'm curious, going from that, these two roles really feel like a special kind of moment for you because they are so rich and they're both very different characters, as you mentioned. Did you find after The Crown, a desire to find your way into roles like these? Did they come easy, or what was that transition like after you finished your run on that show?
Well, I felt so lucky with that show because, you know, it was we knew we had 2 seasons and therefore it was 20 hours. And if that was a film, then that character, Margaret, would have been in the background smoking a few cigarettes, maybe like, having a drink and then like flouncing off. So the fact that I got to kind of grow up with her and chart her young life, I was desperate to do the later stuff. I wanted to smash loads of plates and scream at Anthony Armstrong Jones that amazing Helena has got to do that. So I knew that I had to kind of set up her why she turned hard, and I always thought that person that everyone knows her later on in life as being so bitter and really, really damaged. And I was like, but she wouldn't have been like that when she was little. So what happened? So it was an amazing journey to do that. And I think having that, two things, I remember Claire and I being really struck about halfway through the first season where we sort of turned to each other and we were like, this feels, oh my God, I feel so much space to like really go on a journey with this person. And I think it was because there were real female roles where they weren't defined by the men, and so many scripts I had read before, it was often the male protagonist, and suddenly it was a show where you had this real female protagonist at the front and center, and me as a supporting part had my own journey completely, and that felt amazing because it meant that you could really do some work that you had always wanted to do, or had the space to be able to do. And so after finishing Margaret, I just thought I hadn't ever led a movie before, and Pieces is my first lead, and that felt so special. And I was really, I felt, I'd watched lots of people do it, and I was like really waiting my time and learning loads and trying to absorb how other people do it, and I felt really ready to do it by that point. And it was, again, in both these movies, it had the same feeling as Margaret, where you just felt like, oh, there's space to really explore this nature of person, and really that's what I look for now. And The Crown, like you said, it was a real benchmark.
Between Princess Margaret and Tally and Martha, you have characters with also very different looks, and I'm curious how that helps you find your way into role. In this case, I'll ask about World to Come, and that hair. Like, what part of that character, the appearance, helps you find your way in? And what were those conversations like with Tally in terms of her look?
Yeah, that was Mona went, I need her to have iconic hair. And I went, how on earth do you do that? So, she always imagined her as a redhead. But interestingly, actually, Margaret really gave me this incredible gift because it really taught me as an actor, because she was a character who, really cared about aesthetics and had time to, and had the resources to spend a lot of time doing like lots of fittings of dresses and things like that. And so consequently I was in a lot of fittings, and I'm not naturally, that's definitely not my forte. So but I had to, and what I learned was, with her, I really learned the relationship to costume, and it isn't about how you're perceived, right? It's not like, okay, let's choose this costume so that the audience think. It's more, how does this person choose to express parts of themselves somehow, you know? And that character on the crown, like Princess Margaret literally wakes up in the morning, and how I felt, however she's feeling, she wears it. She wears what she's feeling, you know. If she's feeling amazing that day, she'll wear some crazy ball gown with loads of like skin out and like flounce around the corridors going to snog Peter Townsend in his office. Do you know what I mean? I like she taught me that. She taught me that relationship in a way, and I've always carried that on really, and applied it to the work really. So with Tally, it was very much of what's her nature, therefore what it gets expressed on the outside. And so the hair being really wild and not done, and I never wanted it to be too like ladylike. She's actually a real kind of like natural, quite wild, elemental person. And so gradually, bit by bit, we found our way into it. And it's this amazing moment that starts to happen when you really are you really are beginning to get inside someone as a character, or you as that person, more to the point. And suddenly you go, if you put something on and you go, oh, this doesn't. She wouldn't, like with Margaret. Often it was like she wouldn't be seen dead in this. Absolutely not. There's one point where Claire and I's skirt got mixed up, and it was in my and I went, oh no. She wouldn't wear that color in that shape. And that's a beautiful moment when you really know how they, which is very different to you, obviously. I mean, I tend to just wear this kind of stuff all the time. But yeah, and for Martha, that was also a really interesting. Well, you asked about World to Come, didn't ask about Martha.
I'd be happy to hear about Martha too.
Well, yeah, that always felt like armor, because of how she's feeling, defensiveness, and often kind of quite bright colors to avert, to not wear black or be in mourning, because she's defending herself. When she first goes into the office, she's wearing a bright red coat, and it's a kind of that always felt like a steel plate of armor, or all her clothes, because she's trying not to. She doesn't want any of her skin exposed, or to, anyone to really look like, to see her pain. Yeah.
Well, if The Crown taught you that about costuming and the sort of importance of that for the character, what did Pieces of a Woman teach you as an actor?
It was quite a sustained. The movie is someone's journey through a really extreme grief, and I guess it taught me to sustain that level of feeling through a long shoot. And also just honestly, I went into it not really knowing how I could feel those things and not show them, And I honestly, even though I was feeling them, I didn't know if the camera was reading it really, I was thinking all her thoughts, and I was really feeling it inside myself. But at the end of the shoot, I was like, oh my God, what if it just looks like I'm doing nothing? Because that's not necessarily how I have expressed grief, or might express grief. Yeah, I'm a really external, outward person. So I didn't know if it would work. I didn't know. And then I thought, oh no, we might have a really boring movie, because then you're just watching someone just sit on a bus or like walk or not ever articulate how she's feeling. So it taught me the power of thoughts, and kind of reaffirmed my way into whatever this bizarre job acting is really, which is, I think, yeah, thinking someone else's thoughts and trying to trace what they are in the first place, and then try and do enough preparation so that you can actually, possibly get in touch with what they really are, those thoughts.
Well, before I let you go, I wanted to ask you a little meta question right now. We're here virtually. And this is, for our Awardist podcast, is of course really the first Oscar season that you've been walking through in this way. I'm just curious what the experience has been like for you, talking to people like me over Zoom, not necessarily jumping from event to event like we would normally do. Has it been, given the attention, a little strange?
Yes, I mean, I would much rather be in a room with you,
Yeah.
but equally, yeah, I've never had this experience before. I'm so deeply grateful that people want to talk about the film because it's so amazing and important that we're even having the conversations about the subject and the fact that,
Hmm.
people, it's not often talked about. So that means everything to me, really. And yeah, I mean, I haven't, yeah, it's it's all been virtual for me this year, but except for Venice,
Yeah,
which
yeah. I
was
was
in
gonna say you got to go
person.
to the Venice Film Festival.
And that was a miracle. And Tilda was Swinton was there, my agent looks after, and we were having a drink at the beginning. She said, "Oh no, it's nothing like it usually is. Oh darling, like you'd have loved it." And I was like, "Oh, but I don't know any different." So for me, it's of course I'd love to be with you in person. It's always better, but I think it's the way of things at the moment, isn't it? And the fact that the film is coming on Netflix hopefully means that more people will be able to see it, or people that might need to.
I think it'll find its audience, and I hope the world to come does as well. Vanessa
Mm.
Kirby, thank you so much.
Thank you,
It's been a
David.
pleasure, and both of the films are excellent. Everybody, seek them out if you haven't. All right. I'm David Canfield. This has been The Awardist with Vanessa Kirby.